Welcome to the Writer Reads Chronicles of a Dark God, Book 2, Dark God's Rise, Chapter 20 of Apprentices and Plans. Falcon glanced up. Brianda? The girl that warned you, Roma said shortly. And kept their leader's attention long enough for us to get many to safety, Falcon answered quietly. She did? Falcon nodded and drew flint and tinder from his pouch. He didn't answer until he lit the fire. We've time to eat before we join the lady, he said. We'll see to rescuing your friend from there. Roma shook his head. I agree with taking time to eat, he said, but we don't have time to join the others, and the delay of dealing with what will greet us. But my lady is expecting you, Falcon argued. What trouble do you expect? Rama tilted his head to one side, then waved a hand up and down his front. My colouring, he answered shortly, then gestured at Ghost, whose own markings appeared to dance in the firelight. Our race? Falcon sighed, but didn't argue. Instead, he took a long, straight piece of wood from the pile and felt at his belt for his knife. Here. Roma drew the forester's paired blades from his own belt and passed them over. Falcon accepted them with a nod of thanks and began sharpening one end of the stick. Do you have any food? He asked. When silence answered his question, he glanced up and saw Grunwald and Roma exchange an embarrassed look. No supplies, he concluded, and Roma shook his head. We were going to call on the lady of the keep, he said, before she went about her morning work. He shrugged. But we arrived barely in time to hide from the raiders. Except for the girl. Brianda? Falcon prodded, concluding firmly. She didn't hide. Brianda, Grunwald confirmed. She hid with the rest of us, but there were two who didn't get off the trail in time, and then she ran out to push them into hiding. And then didn't have time to hide herself, Falcon concluded, his eyes widening. That was the girl? The half-elf who ran to the village to warn us. It was, Roma confirmed, then glared at Grunwald. And he prevented me from going to her aid. And it was a good thing he did, a new voice interrupted. Roma recognized Syndra's scolding tones and pivoted toward her, but the girl wasn't finished. If Grunwald hadn't kept you in place and quiet, she added, the raiders would have discovered us all, and we wouldn't be able to plan her rescue now. Syndra, Grunwald said, pointing at her by way of introduction. He shifted his hand to indicate the other girl, Zareen. At the mention of her name, the girl raised her head, and they saw her eyes were still damp with tears. We have to rescue them, she said. If it wasn't for me, she'd. Syndra hushed her, patting her hand reassuringly. It's not, she began, only to have Zareen cut her off. It is. Raneth and I were arguing. He was trying to convince me to stay with the mistress, but I don't want to. Her words trailed off in a wail, and she hiccuped as she continued trying to explain. I get no peace there. Raneth? It took Roma several heartbeats to link the shortened form with the shape changer's real name. He scowled at the familiarity there, wondering what it meant for the pair's relationship. Syndra startled him from his thoughts with a sharp slap to Zareen's arm. Foolish child, she snapped. You'd get no peace from him either as a master. That's not what I meant, Zareen sniffed and turned to Roma. You'd understand. Understand what? Alessia demanded, emerging from the bushes behind the girls. Glancing around, Roma noticed that everyone had arrived. Grunwald had taken a place at his back, and Ghost stood a little apart, in the shadows, her eyes tracking their every move. Syndra and Zareen stood the few steps they'd taken from the clearing's edge, and Alessia stood behind them, brushing leaves and twigs from her gown and face. The only one missing was Brianda. Understand what, Zareen? Alessia repeated, cocking her head and putting one hand on her hip. What would he understand? Zareen started at her mistress's appearance, her face paling and her mouth opening and closing like that of a beached fish as she sought the words to explain. When she could not, she burst into tears, letting Syndra turn her into her shoulder as she wept. Nothing, she cried. He'd understand nothing. Syndra wrapped an arm around her fellow apprentice's shoulders and patted her back. Changing the subject, she said, We found some herbs and berries, and Zareen found mushrooms. I have some jerky, the forester put in. Ha! Now all we need is a pot of some sort, Alessia said with a humorless smile. Falcon reached out to accept the greens and berries the girls had brought, sorting them into two piles. He indicated the smaller of the two. At least we have these and the jerky. And we don't need the fire, Alessia added, coming closer. The forester shrugged. It brings comfort, he said. Of course we need the fire. Roma passed a hand over the food he'd laid out, muttering a soft prayer as he did so. For a moment, Staravan's symbol glowed at the end of its thong. When the prayer ended, the glow faded. It will be sufficient, Roma assured them, dividing the jerky, berries, and greens, and handing them out. He gave the fire a regretful glance, and his face hardened. But after that, we should be on our way. No one argued, and they ate quickly, surprised to find the small amount of rations sufficiently filling. By the time they'd finished eating and made sure the fire was out, it was dusk. The ruins? Falcon asked, but Reomar fixed him with a firm stare. Not if there is somewhere else the raiders are likely to have gone. The direction they left in, could it have led to a similar hiding place? He watched as Falcon's gaze took on a distant look, as if the forester was studying some unseen map and measuring distance in the direction in a way he could not understand. After a long moment, the man's face paled and he shook his head. The ruins, he began, then corrected himself. The road, it leads back to the Wildergen, but there are trails they could take to the ruins. My lady and her people are heading into the thick of it. He was moving as he spoke. I have to save her. Rama reached out and gripped his bicep, turning him back around. How far behind them are we? Falcon took a hasty breath, then held it, and Rama watched the initial panic fade from his eyes, and the hunter rise to take its place. I know a faster way, he said. If we move swiftly, we can beat the Lady Kell and my people to the ruins. Rama squeezed his arm and released him. Then lead the way, he instructed, gathering Alessia and the apprentices around him. Despite the long run they'd had the night before, they kept up with the pace Falcon set, slowing as dusk deepened into twilight. Falcon signaled them to caution as the twilight crept toward full night, then motioned for them to stop as a heart-stopping shriek rent the air. His hiss of warning and the sudden downward cut of his hand ordered them to the ground, and they sank into crouches, hugging the base of trees and nestling close to bushes as he slithered forward. Wait here, he ordered. Roma crept forward to take the forester's place in the lead, barely aware of Ghost's slight figure following his every move. Grunwald remained at the rear of the group, and Alessia kept her apprentices close. Another cry split the air, and Roma shivered. Instead of racing toward it, he forced himself to wait for Falcon, breathing long and deep to calm himself. As night closed around them, Ghost tugged at his sleeve. We must go, Master, she whispered. We must go and see what it is that takes the foresters so long. Roma snapped a glance toward her and frowned. Her amber eyes were wide and dark, the slit of her pupil almost swallowing the color. After a heartbeat, he nodded. He'll either bring the villagers to us or us to them, he agreed. Either way, we shouldn't be here when he returns. Together they wormed their way forward, staying belly close to the ground and moving in the direction Falcon had been taking them. Wait! Alessia's worried whisper stopped them dead. Where are you going? To fetch Brianda, Roma told her. If we free her quietly, we can flee into the forest and away from the village. There can be no error in that. Alessia's look mirrored the way he felt about leaving the villagers to face the slavers on their own. Try as he might to balance the two sides, he couldn't help feeling the raiders were just the tip of the evil roaming the forests. Neither could he deny that the villagers were on the side of an outbalanced good, or that he knew he and those with him would be the ones to even the score. He sighed, resting on his elbows as he bowed his head. You're right, he said. They're going to need all the help we can give them. See if you and your apprentices can make a strike plan. It needn't be spectacular, just effective. The wizardess nodded, firming her lips in a straight line, and Reomar's heart went out to her. Having just been shifted from one deity to another, He could imagine what she was going through. The nature of her magic had changed. For a long moment he thought she was going to object, but she gave him a small, determined nod and turned back to her apprentices. When the three of them were engrossed in an exercise to draw and focus the magic they called, he moved silently away. The magic gathered, sending a prickle up his spine, and he looked back. Alessia had dropped all pretense of calling her magic in a tidy fashion, and now crouched alone. Sindra and Zareen continued the exercise they'd started, but Alessia's magic swirled around her like a lightning storm. "Whatever you're doing, Mouse, work it out fast," Romar muttered, and crept back to Ghost. "He comes," the child informed him. "And he comes alone. He has not betrayed us, Master." Romar settled beside her, out of sight, and watched as the forester returned. Falcon came through the trees, making less noise than a breeze through the grass. He saw immediately that Reomar and Ghost were missing, and looked around for them. His sharp eyes scanned the trees and bushes near the clearing's edge, and came to rest on the priest and the slender child at his side. "I did not betray you, brother," he said, his voice soft with a hint of sadness. "The villagers have begun their attack on the raiders. They will need our help, and I do not think, at the end, that they will worry about the form that help takes." As if to confirm the truth of his words, another cry rang out, unmistakably human, and unmistakably in pain. Rama Roma flinched at the agony in it, and felt Ghost startle at his side. He rose reluctantly to his feet. "Tell me," he murmured, "what do you propose for us to do?" As he spoke, he felt the magic subside, and heard Alessia and her apprentices cross the grass to join them, and Falcon knelt and cleared a patch of earth on the forest floor. "The ruins lie here," he said, scratching several squares on the ground. He continued speaking as he drew another set of squares behind the first. "The villagers have chosen to strike the cages where the bandits hold their prisoners." His eyes shadowed momentarily at the thought of it, then cleared as he forced his mind back to the present and the plan before him. "I fear it may not be the wisest course of action, but it is the most logical for them, and I am afraid the raiders are prepared." He sighed, swallowed hard, and tapped at one of the meticulously drawn squares. This looks fairly intact, and I'm hazarding a guess it is where we'll find their leader." He met Riomer's eyes with a hard stare. "Take the leader and his lieutenants, and we stand a chance of defeating the rest." "Or driving them away," Cromwell rumbled, and Falcon nodded. "Or that," he said, looking from the Northman to Riomer for approval. "And Brianda?" Riomer asked. "Did you see her?" Again a shadow passed across the forester's eyes. "Aye," he answered, swallowing as though clearing a sour taste from his mouth. "I thought I saw her, but we'll need to take the main building to get to her." "And why's that?" Rama asked, dreading the answer. "Because that's where she's being held," Falcon told him. "The raiders singled her out for some special treatment." Silence followed his words, Rama clenching his hands into fists. After several heartbeats, he found the words for a question he didn't want answered. "What sort of special treatment?" Falcon dug the point of his stick into the ground, gouging a single hole deeply in the center of his map. His throat moved as he swallowed at some remembered sight. Rama shifted impatiently, and the forester glanced at him. "She's in a room not far from the forest's edge," he replied, moving the stick to tap one corner of the building. "They've tied her, eagle spread, stretched from floor shackle. They've tied her, eagle spread, stretched from floor shackles to ceiling thongs in the center." He paused, the stick digging more deeply into the room's center. This time he looked like he might throw up. "She's been beaten," he said, ducking his head to avoid the slow, smouldering fire in Riomer's eyes. "The room's in the basement of the building." He swallowed again. "She's half-elven," he said. "No, but you saw her?" "I did, but couldn't be sure," Falcon admitted. "She's half-elven," Riomer confirmed. "Her father was a Rose's diplomat." "Then we have to free her quickly," Falcon told him, and continued as Riomer's brows rose. "Their leader is from the Silver Mountains tribes." "White Mountains?" "Some call them that. but not where they can hear it. And he's got Brianda. Falcon dipped his chin and went on. Full bloods of either race they'll tolerate, but half breeds. He allowed his voice to trail away and poked angrily at the ground. So you're acquainted with more than my own race, Rayamar concluded. Raiders come from more than one source, Falcon replied shortly. One day you'll have to tell me the tale. Falcon dipped his chin in acknowledgement. One day, perhaps, I'll agree to do so, he said, casually swept his hair away from his closest ear to reveal scars where pointed tips might once have been. I've had dealings with the Silver Mountains. He shuddered, his face paling with the horror of that memory. I never wanted dealings with them ever again. He paused, then met Raomar's eyes. Your people are paragons of kindness when it comes to half-breeds, if you compare them to the Silver Mountains. He paused in gouging holes from the ground, setting the stick's point firmly in the dirt. Roma almost reached out to touch him, but stayed his hand, instead leaving Falcon to sit and stare at the map in brooding silence. It was Ghost who broke the silence. She reached out and shook Roma's wrist, meeting his worried look with a wild look that said Falcon's own fear and the knowledge of what Silver Mountains did to half-breeds had shaken her. Her voice, on the other hand, came as a fierce, childish treble. "Tell us the plan," she ordered. "I will free Brianda." Her words brought a smile to Falcon's face. "And how," he challenged gently, "are you going to reach her without being captured yourself?" Ghost's eyes narrowed, but not enough to hide the fires that had been kindled behind them. "You," she answered fiercely, "will create a diversion." Falcon's doubtful smile became a wolfish grin. "This, then," he said, "is what we shall do."